The thing that connects the worst catastrophes in human history isn't cruelty. It's confidence. Not the confidence of soldiers, not the confidence of conquerors, the confidence of planners. Men who looked at the complexity of human life, at the price of bread, the arrangement of cities, the structure of families, the distribution of land, and decided they understood it well enough to redesign it from scratch. That confidence killed more people in the 20th century than any plague in recorded history. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Most of them genuinely believed they were doing good. There's a number that doesn't get quoted in polite company. The political scientist R.J. Rummel spent decades cataloging what he called democide, death by government. Not deaths in combat, not war casualties on a battlefield, deaths caused directly by governments acting on their own populations. His estimate for the 20th century alone, 262 million people. 262 million. To put that in some kind of scale, that's roughly the entire population of the United States as it stood in the 1980s. Gone. Not from war with a foreign enemy. From governments making decisions about the people living under them. The question that number raises is one we almost never ask out loud, because we're so used to explaining each disaster separately. Stalin was a paranoid tyrant. Mao was a revolutionary fanatic. Pol Pot was a nihilist with an ideology nobody else on Earth shared. We file them under their names, their countries, their decades, their particular brands of madness, and we move on. But what if the names are a distraction? What if the question isn't who these men were, but what kind of system made men like them inevitable? That's the question a 35-year-old Austrian economist was sitting with in the early 1940s. His name was Friedrich Hayek. He'd been watching from London as the century's great experiments in centralized control were beginning to show what they actually produced. And he wrote a book, modest in length, radical in argument, that his publisher initially didn't want to print because it was going to make enemies. He called it The Road to Serfdom. He was right about what it would do. And he was right about almost everything in it. I want to show you the mechanism he documented. Not the ideology, the mechanism. Because what Hayek discovered wasn't a political opinion. It was a structural fact about how power behaves when it's concentrated enough to override what ordinary people actually know. And once you see the mechanism, you can't unsee it. It explains too much. Before we get there, let's name the obvious answer, the one almost everyone reaches for. These disasters happened because evil men seized power. It's a satisfying explanation. It locates the cause in a person, which means it locates the solution in removing the person. Get rid of Stalin, the purges end. Remove Mao, the famine stops. Eliminate Pol Pot, the killing fields close. There's truth in this. These men were capable of extraordinary cruelty, and their personal decisions mattered. But the explanation has a problem it can't solve. Evil is not rare. History is full of cruel and ambitious men who never produced anything like this scale of destruction. Medieval monarchs were brutal. Colonial administrators were brutal. Warlords throughout Africa and Asia in the same century were brutal. None of them came close to matching the body count of the 20th century's centralized states. Cruelty was a constant. The scale was new. Something else changed. And Hayek saw what it was. He started where you wouldn't expect, not with politics, but with a question about information. In 1945, 1 year after The Road to Serfdom, he published a paper that many economists now consider one of the most important ever written. He called it The Use of Knowledge in Society. And the argument he made in it was deceptively simple. No single mind, and no single institution, no matter how staffed and funded and intelligent, can possess the knowledge that is spread across millions of human lives. Think about what it actually takes to know the right price for a pound of wheat in rural Ohio. You need to know the local harvest, the condition of the roads, the fuel costs of the trucks that would carry it, the preferences of the families who would buy it, the alternatives they have available, the wages of the people doing the farm work, the cost of the machinery they're using, the expectations about next year's weather. None of this information exists in one place. It exists in the heads of millions of people, accumulated through direct experience, local knowledge, trial and error over generations. And the price system, the number that emerges when buyers and sellers interact voluntarily, is how all of that information gets compressed and communicated across an entire economy without anyone having to gather it or understand it or process it centrally. Hayek called this the knowledge problem. And his point wasn't that central planners were stupid or corrupt, it was that the job they were trying to do was structurally impossible. The knowledge they needed didn't exist in the form they needed it. It was dispersed, it was tacit. Much of it couldn't even be put into words. It lived in skills and habits and relationships that took lifetimes to develop. When a government sets prices by decree rather than letting them emerge from exchange, when it replaces the price signal with a planning directive, it doesn't fill the information gap. It destroys the only mechanism that was filling it. The map gets erased, and everyone navigates blind. That's not a metaphor. That's what happened to farmers in China in 1958. That's what happened to grain in Ukraine in 1932. That's what happened in the killing fields of Cambodia in 1975. The planners didn't fail because they had bad data. They failed because the act of planning eliminated the system that generated good data in the first place. But the knowledge problem only explains why central planning fails economically. It doesn't explain the bodies. For that, you need the second part of what Hayek documented. And it's darker. Chapter 10 of The Road to Serfdom carries a title that sounds almost academic. Why the worst get on top. Hayek's argument is this. In any centrally planned system, once the state has accumulated enough power to override voluntary exchange, a specific selection process begins. And it doesn't select for the most competent, it doesn't select for the most visionary, it selects for the most willing to use coercion. Here's the logic. Planning requires compliance. The plan only works if people do what the plan requires, whether they want to or not. A farmer who responds to falling grain prices by reducing production is a problem for a planner who needs grain production to increase. A factory manager who reports true output figures when those figures fall short of quota is a problem for a planner whose model assumes the quota will be met. A doctor who prescribes what the patient needs rather than what the system has authorized is a problem for a central health authority that needs standardized treatment. The plan cannot accommodate the person who acts on local knowledge rather than central direction. So the plan eliminates them, reassigns them, demotes them, eventually punishes them. Who remains? The person willing to execute orders regardless of what they actually know. The person able to suppress the evidence in front of their own eyes in favor of the directive coming from above. The person who, when the farmer tells him the harvest failed, reports to headquarters that the harvest succeeded, because reporting the truth would end his career and reporting the lie keeps him in the system. This selection happens at every level. It happens in the local administrator who fills the quota on paper while his district starves. It happens in the regional official who passes the lie upward to protect his position. It happens all the way to the top, where the people who remain are the ones who were willing, at every step, to choose the plan over the reality in front of them. Good people leave the system. They emigrate, they go silent, they find ways to exist at the margins. The conscientious, the honest, the competent, they're selected against because their competence and honesty make them liabilities to a plan that cannot accommodate either. What's left at the apex of power after this selection runs long enough? You already know the answer. You've seen his face on the history books. Hayek wasn't describing a personality type, he was describing a structural outcome. Give any system, regardless of its stated values, regardless of its founding idealism, regardless of the intelligence of its architects, give any system enough centralized power long enough, and the selection will run. The mechanism doesn't care about intentions, it only cares about compliance. Now let me show you 3 cases, not as history lectures, as demonstrations of the mechanism. The Great Leap Forward. China, 1958 to 1962. Mao Zedong decided that China would industrialize faster than any nation in history. Central planners issued production quotas for steel, for grain, for everything, based on targets that bore no relationship to what local conditions could actually deliver. The historian Frank Dikötter, working from provincial Communist Party archives that were only opened in the 2000s, documented what happened at the local level. When village officials reported true harvests that fell short of quota, they were accused of rightism. They were demoted, punished, sometimes killed. So they stopped reporting true harvests. They reported what the quota required. Officials above them passed those numbers upward. Officials above them did the same. The plan showed a successful harvest. Grain was exported while villages starved. Because the plan's model showed there was surplus grain. There was no surplus. There had never been a surplus. The system had selected, at every level, for the person willing to lie to the plan rather than report what they actually knew. 45 million people died, the largest man-made famine in recorded history. The Holodomor, Ukraine, 1932 to 1933. Soviet collectivization required that agricultural land be seized from private farmers and consolidated into state-controlled collectives. Grain quotas were set by central planners in Moscow. The historian Robert Conquest documented, in exhaustive detail, what those quotas meant on the ground. They were set and enforced regardless of what the actual harvest produced. The 1932 harvest failed. The quotas were not adjusted, they were enforced. Brigades went village to village, taking grain, including seed grain, the grain that would have produced next year's harvest. Farmers who hid food to survive were treated as saboteurs of the plan. The price system would have communicated the shortage. It would have redirected supply, raised prices, triggered outside assistance, sent every available signal that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The price system had been abolished. There was no signal. There was only the plan, which said the harvest had occurred and the grain would be delivered. Between 3.5 and 7 million Ukrainians died. Cambodia, 1975 to 1979. The Khmer Rouge, under Pol Pot, attempted what no other regime in the 20th century had quite dared: to begin human society over from zero. Year Zero, they called it. All history prior to the revolution was declared corrupt and discarded. Cities were emptied. Money was abolished. Schools were closed. The family structure was disrupted. Children were separated from parents, who were relocated to agricultural labor camps. Every institution that had accumulated knowledge across generations, the market, the monastery, the school, the family itself, was identified as a relic of the old world and swept away. This was the fatal conceit in its purest form. Hayek used that phrase later in his last book, written when he was in his 80s, to describe the belief that human reason is sufficient to design a better social order from scratch. That the accumulated wisdom encoded in evolved institutions is not information but obstacle. That you can tear everything down and build something better if only you have the right plan. The Khmer Rouge had the right plan. They were certain of it. Within 4 years, an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people were dead, roughly 1 in 4 Cambodians. Not as a side effect of a policy that failed, as the direct result of a policy that was executing exactly as intended. 3 different countries, 3 different ideologies, 3 different languages and cultures and histories, 1 mechanism. The plan required suppressing what people actually knew. Suppressing what people actually knew required eliminating the people who knew it. Eliminating those people required concentrating power in the hands of whoever was willing to do the eliminating. The monster wasn't the cause. The monster was the output. There's something Hayek said in his Nobel Prize lecture in 1974. He was 75 years old, and the world had spent most of his career ignoring him, that I want you to hold for a moment. He said that what had gone wrong in economics, and in social policy more broadly, was a pretense of knowledge. The belief that the complexity of human society could be modeled and managed by sufficiently sophisticated experts. That if a policy failed, the failure could always be attributed to insufficient application, not enough of it, not implemented correctly, not given enough time, rather than to the act of applying it in the first place. This is the mechanism that makes itself permanent. When the Great Leap Forward produced famine, the answer was more collectivization, not less. When Soviet agriculture collapsed, the answer was more central control of distribution. When Cambodian society disintegrated under Year Zero, the Khmer Rouge didn't conclude that Year Zero was wrong. They concluded that the enemies of Year Zero were more numerous than anticipated. Every failure of the plan becomes evidence for the plan's expansion, because the alternative, admitting that the plan itself was the problem, would require admitting that the entire structure of authority was built on a false premise. This is not a historical curiosity, it is a living pattern, and you have watched it operate in real time. Think about what it meant when the experts managing monetary policy told you for years that the inflation they were engineering was transitory, when their model said one thing and your grocery bill said another. When the gap between the plan's predictions and your own direct experience grew wide enough to walk through, and the response was not to question the model, but to question your perception, the pretense of knowledge. Hayek described it in 1974. He was describing something structural about how concentrated expertise behaves when it answers to a plan rather than to results. He also described something else: Who ends up administering the pretense? Here is what I've laid out so far. One of Hayek's core warnings, the structural one, the one that runs through every 20th century catastrophe and connects them through a single mechanism. But Hayek didn't leave it here. He documented 12 specific warnings, and several of them describe not 1944, but what's happening in this country right now, in the currency, in the universities, in the expert class, in the conversation you're trying to have at your own dinner table. I've put all 12 in a guide, each one in plain language, with a real 2020 to 2026 example and one argument you can actually use. Link is in the description. Now here's the inversion that I want you to sit with for a moment, because it changes everything. The standard story about the 20th century's great catastrophes goes like this. A visionary but flawed plan was corrupted by the wrong person gaining control of it. If only the right leader had been in charge. If only the implementation had been less brutal. If only the people had cooperated more fully. The plan was good. The people failed it. What Hayek documented is the opposite. The plan produced the people. The selection mechanism ran, not because Stalin was uniquely evil, not because Mao was uniquely fanatical, not because Pol Pot was uniquely nihilistic, but because any system that concentrates enough power to override what people actually know will select, structurally and inevitably, for the person willing to enforce that override. At every level, through every generation of the system's operation, you don't need a monster at the beginning. You need only a plan. The monster is what the plan builds, over time, out of the ordinary material of human ambition and fear and compliance. Hayek wasn't describing communism specifically. He was describing a structural logic that applies wherever power concentrates enough to suppress the distributed knowledge of ordinary people in favor of a centrally administered vision of how things ought to be. The Curious Task of Economics, he wrote in his last book, he was 89 years old, still at his desk, is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. That sentence isn't pessimism. It's the most important defense of human freedom ever put into economic language. Because it says, the reason to distrust concentrated power is not that power attracts bad people. The reason is that concentrated power, by its nature, produces them. The defense of liberty isn't a sentiment, it's an understanding of mechanism. And mechanism can be taught, which means it can be passed on. Hayek spent most of his career being wrong, in the eyes of the people who mattered. At 68, he was considered an intellectual relic, a man whose ideas had lost the great debate of the 20th century, outcompeted by economists who believed that sophisticated management of the economy was not only possible but necessary. Then, at 75, he received the Nobel Prize. At 80, his ideas were reshaping governments on 2 continents. At 89, he was still writing, still revising, still pushing the argument forward. He did not live to see everything he described. He did live long enough to see that describing it accurately was, in the end, enough. That's not a small thing, when the feeling you're sitting with is that clarity comes too late to matter. It doesn't. Clarity about mechanism is exactly what travels from generation to generation, across kitchen tables and dinner conversations and the books we hand to people we love. The catastrophes Hayek warned about are in the past. The mechanism that produced them is not. The question that stays with me, and I'll leave it with you without an answer because the honest answer is that nobody has it fully yet, is this. At what point does a society that has begun the process he described reach the threshold past which the selection has already run far enough to make reversal very difficult? Not impossible. Hayek believed correction was always possible, given enough people who understood what they were correcting. But he was also honest about the cost of finding out that you waited too long. Tell me this, what's the one thing you saw coming that nobody around you believed at the time? I read every response. And I mean it when I say that what this channel is trying to do, what Hayek spent his life doing, is give the people who already sensed the pattern, the language, to explain it to the people who couldn't see it yet. That's not a small thing either.